Have you ever felt like you were drowning in expectations that weren't even yours to carry? Like every decision you made, every choice you considered, every dream you whispered to yourself had to pass through an invisible jury of relatives who somehow believed they had the right to vote on your life? Well, let me tell you something that changed everything for me. Something that cost me relationships I thought were unbreakable, but gave me something far more valuable in return: myself. This is the story of how I learned to set boundaries with my family, and how they absolutely hated me for it. But before we dive deep into this journey, I need you to understand something crucial. This isn't just my story. This is the story of thousands, maybe millions of people who have felt the suffocating weight of family judgment pressing down on their chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to simply be who they truly are. I grew up in a family where everyone had an opinion about everything, and somehow those opinions always seemed to matter more than my own feelings, my own thoughts, my own desires. It started small, the way these things always do. Little comments here and there about what I should wear, how I should style my hair, what subjects I should study in school. My aunt would say things like, "Oh, honey, that color doesn't suit you at all. You should really listen to me. I know what looks good." And my uncle would interrupt my conversations to tell me I was wrong about something he knew nothing about. My grandmother had this way of sighing dramatically whenever I shared something I was excited about, as if my happiness was somehow a personal disappointment to her. And my parents? God, my parents were the worst because they enabled all of it. They participated in it. They created this environment where everyone's voice mattered except mine. I remember being 14 years old, standing in our kitchen after a family dinner, feeling this overwhelming sense of suffocation as I listened to my relatives dissect every aspect of my life like I was some kind of science project they were all collaborating on. They talked about me as if I wasn't even in the room, discussing my future, my personality, my flaws, my potential, everything, all while I stood there feeling smaller and smaller with each passing minute. The thing about growing up in an environment like this is that you don't immediately recognize it as toxic. You think it's normal because it's all you've ever known. You think every family operates this way, with everyone weighing in on everyone else's business, with love and control intertwined so tightly that you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. I thought the constant scrutiny was just them caring about me. I told myself that their judgment came from a place of love, that they only wanted what was best for me, that I should be grateful to have so many people invested in my life. But here's what I didn't understand then. What took me years of therapy and countless sleepless nights to finally grasp. Love doesn't control. Love doesn't diminish. Love doesn't make you feel like you need permission to exist as yourself. Real love creates space for you to grow, to make mistakes, to discover who you are without fear of constant criticism or rejection. The love I experienced growing up wasn't really love at all. It was control dressed up in concern, manipulation wrapped in family loyalty, and judgment disguised as guidance. I spent my teenage years trying to mold myself into the person they wanted me to be, constantly adjusting my personality, my interests, my dreams to match their expectations. When I wanted to study art, they told me it was impractical and pushed me toward business. When I dated someone they didn't approve of, they made my life miserable until I ended the relationship. When I expressed opinions that differed from theirs, they made me feel stupid, naive, ungrateful for questioning the wisdom of my elders. Every single aspect of my identity was subject to their approval, and the worst part was that I gave them that power. I handed over my autonomy because I didn't know I had the right to keep it. The anxiety started when I was around 16. I'd wake up in the middle of the night with my heart racing, my chest tight, my mind spiraling through all the ways I was failing to meet their expectations. I started having panic attacks before family gatherings, spending hours in the bathroom trying to calm myself down, practicing what I would say, how I would act, desperately trying to anticipate every possible criticism so I could defend against it, or better yet, avoid it altogether. I became hypervigilant, always watching everyone's facial expressions, analyzing their tone of voice, searching for signs of disapproval so I could course correct before they even voiced their judgment. It was exhausting, living like that, constantly performing, never relaxing, never feeling safe to just be myself without consequences. My college years offered a brief respite, a taste of freedom that simultaneously thrilled and terrified me. Away from home, I started discovering who I actually was beneath all those layers of expectations and conditioning. I made friends who accepted me without trying to change me. I explored interests that my family would have mocked. I made decisions based on what I wanted rather than what would please everyone else. For the first time in my life, I felt like I could breathe deeply, like there was actual space in my lungs for air instead of just anxiety and fear of disappointing people. But even then, even hundreds of miles away, their voices followed me. I'd be making a decision about something as simple as what to have for dinner, and I'd hear my mother's voice in my head criticizing my choices. I'd be getting dressed for a party, and my aunt's judgmental comments about my appearance would echo through my mind. I'd be considering a career opportunity, and my father's dismissive attitude toward my dreams would make me question everything. They had colonized my inner world so completely that I couldn't escape them even when they weren't physically present. The real trouble started when I graduated and moved back to my hometown for a job opportunity. Suddenly, I was back in their orbit, back under their scrutiny, and they expected me to just slot back into that old dynamic as if those years of independence had never happened. But I had changed. I had grown. I had experienced what it felt like to make my own choices without a committee of relatives weighing in, and I couldn't go back to that suffocating existence. The first few months were a nightmare of boundary violations and invasive questions. My mother would let herself into my apartment without calling first, going through my things, rearranging my furniture, criticizing how I kept my home. My father would show up at my workplace unannounced to take me to lunch, but really to interrogate me about my personal life and offer unsolicited advice about my career. My extended family would call constantly, expecting detailed updates about everything I was doing, everyone I was seeing, every decision I was contemplating. They acted like my adulthood was just a technicality, like I still needed their permission and approval for everything. And honestly, at first, I fell right back into those old patterns because they were so deeply ingrained. I'd answer their invasive questions, I'd accommodate their unannounced visits, I'd listen to their unsolicited advice and pretend to consider it seriously. I'd show up to family gatherings and endure their criticism with a smile, apologizing for my choices, defending my decisions, exhausting myself trying to justify my existence to people who had already made up their minds about who I should be. But something was different this time. That taste of freedom I'd experienced had awakened something in me that couldn't be put back to sleep. Every time I compromised myself to please them, every time I swallowed my authentic response to give them what they wanted, every time I prioritized their comfort over my own well-being, I felt this growing resentment building inside me like pressure in a volcano. I started having nightmares about being trapped, about suffocating, about losing myself completely. I'd wake up gasping for air, terrified that I was going to spend the rest of my life as a puppet, dancing to strings pulled by relatives who loved the idea of me, but had no interest in knowing the real me. The catalyst came on an ordinary Tuesday evening. I was 26 years old, sitting in my parents' living room during what was supposed to be a casual family dinner, when my uncle started in on me about my relationship status. He'd been drinking, which always made him more aggressive with his opinions, and he launched into this entire speech about how I was getting too old to be so picky, how I needed to settle down before it was too late, how my standards were unrealistic, and I was going to end up alone. My aunt chimed in with agreement, adding her own commentary about how I'd let several perfectly good potential partners slip away because I was too focused on my career. My mother nodded along. My father looked away uncomfortably but said nothing in my defense, and my grandmother actually said, and I will never forget these words, "We're only trying to help you before you make a mess of your life like you usually do." Something inside me snapped. Not dramatically, not loudly, but definitively. It was like a switch flipped, and suddenly I saw the situation with complete clarity. These people, these relatives who claimed to love me, were sitting around a dinner table dissecting my life, my choices, my worth as a human being, and they genuinely believed they had the right to do so. They thought their opinions about my life mattered more than my own feelings. They assumed their comfort with my choices was more important than my happiness. They acted as if my existence was something they had a controlling stake in, as if I owed them a version of myself that fit their preferences, regardless of what it cost me. Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below because I need to know I'm not alone in this. I stood up from that table, and for the first time in my entire life, I spoke my truth without apologizing for it, without softening it, without caring about how it would be received. I said, I need all of you to stop. Stop commenting on my life. Stop judging my decisions. Stop treating me like I'm a problem that needs to be solved or a project that needs your input. I'm 26 years old, I have a career, I pay my own bills, I make my own choices, and I don't need or want your constant criticism disguised as concern. The silence that followed was deafening. My uncle's face turned red. My aunt's mouth dropped open. My mother looked like I'd slapped her. And my father finally looked at me, really looked at me, with an expression I couldn't quite read. My grandmother recovered first, her voice dripping with indignation as she said, How dare you speak to your family this way? After everything we've done for you, after all the love and support we've given you, this is how you repay us? With disrespect and ingratitude? And there it was, the classic manipulation tactic I'd experienced my entire life. Any attempt to set boundaries or assert my autonomy was immediately reframed as disrespect, ingratitude, betrayal of the family. They couldn't conceive of a world where I could love them and still refuse to let them control me, where I could appreciate what they'd done for me while also recognizing the harm they'd caused. In their minds, family loyalty meant absolute submission to the collective judgment, and anything less was an act of aggression against them. I didn't back down this time. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands were shaking. My voice wavered slightly, but I held my ground. "I'm not being disrespectful," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm setting boundaries. There's a difference. I love you all, but I can't continue to live my life according to your expectations. I can't keep letting you judge every decision I make. I can't keep feeling like I need your permission to exist as myself." My mother started crying, which was her go-to manipulation technique whenever anyone in the family tried to assert themselves. "How can you say these things?" she sobbed. "We're your family. We only want what's best for you. Everything we've ever said or done has been out of love." I felt the familiar guilt creeping in. That old programming that told me I was being cruel, that I should apologize, that I should take it all back and return to the comfortable prison of their expectations. But I fought against it this time. I recognized it for what it was: a manipulation designed to keep me compliant, to make me responsible for their emotional reactions to my boundaries. "If you really wanted what was best for me," I said quietly, "you'd respect my right to make my own choices, even if you disagree with them. You'd support me without conditions. You'd love me for who I am, not for who you want me to be." The aftermath of that dinner was brutal. I left my parents' house that night knowing that something fundamental had shifted, that I'd crossed a line I could never uncross. The phone calls started the next day. First my mother, crying and accusing me of breaking her heart. Then my aunt, telling me I was being selfish and immature. My uncle sent me a long text message about how disappointed he was in me, how I'd changed, how college and living away from family had corrupted me and made me forget my values. My grandmother didn't contact me at all, which somehow felt worse than the others' attacks. She simply cut me off, as if I'd ceased to exist the moment I stopped being the obedient grandchild she'd always known. The extended family took sides, as families do in these situations. Some relatives I barely knew felt entitled to call me and share their opinions about the situation, having heard a version of events that painted me as the villain, the ungrateful child who had disrespected her elders at a family dinner. Nobody asked for my side of the story. Nobody seemed interested in understanding why I'd finally reached my breaking point. They just assumed I was wrong, that I owed my family unlimited access to my life and unlimited power over my decisions, and that my attempt to set boundaries was evidence of my character flaws rather than their dysfunction. The guilt was overwhelming at first. I'd lie awake at night replaying that dinner over and over, wondering if I'd been too harsh, if I should have handled it differently, if I was really being as unreasonable as they said I was. Decades of conditioning don't disappear overnight, and that voice in my head that had been trained to prioritize their feelings over my own well-being kept telling me to apologize, to make things right, to go back to the way things were. But every time I considered doing that, I remembered how I'd felt sitting at that table, how small, how powerless, how suffocated. I remembered all those years of anxiety and panic attacks and feeling like I was drowning in expectations that had nothing to do with my actual happiness or well-being. I remembered that glimpse of freedom I'd experienced in college, that feeling of breathing deeply, of taking up space, of existing without constant fear of judgment. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that I couldn't go back. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in family dynamics and boundary setting. Those sessions were transformative, painful, and liberating in equal measure. For the first time, I heard someone validate my experiences, confirm that what I'd endured wasn't normal or healthy, acknowledge that my family's behavior was controlling and emotionally manipulative. My therapist taught me the language to describe what I'd experienced: enmeshment, emotional abuse, conditional love, triangulation, gaslighting. Each term was like a key unlocking another door in my understanding of my own life. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't ungrateful. I wasn't broken. I was a person who had grown up in a dysfunctional family system and was now trying to break free from patterns that had been established long before I was born. She helped me understand that setting boundaries wasn't selfish or cruel. It was essential for my mental health and well-being. She explained that people who respect you will respect your boundaries, even if they don't like them, and that people who refuse to respect your boundaries are showing you that they value control over relationship. She taught me that I could love my family and still recognize that their behavior was harmful, that I could appreciate what they'd given me while also acknowledging what they'd taken away. Most importantly, she helped me see that I had the right to decide what kind of relationships I wanted in my life, even with family members, and that I didn't owe anyone access to me that compromised my mental health or sense of self. Armed with this new understanding and vocabulary, I started setting concrete boundaries with my family. I sent a carefully worded email to my immediate family and close relatives explaining what I needed going forward. No more unannounced visits. No more commenting on my appearance or relationship status. No more unsolicited advice about my career or life choices. No more discussing me or my decisions at family gatherings when I wasn't present. I explained that I wanted relationships with them, but only if those relationships were based on mutual respect, rather than their expectation of control over my life. I told them I loved them, but that love had to go both ways, and right now it felt very one-sided. I said I was willing to rebuild our relationships on healthier terms, but I couldn't continue in the dynamic we'd always had. The responses ranged from angry to dismissive to manipulative. My father called it a list of demands and said I was being ridiculous. My mother said I was throwing away my family over nothing, that every family has disagreements, and I was being too sensitive. My aunt forwarded my email to other relatives with her own commentary about how I'd lost my mind and needed to be brought back to reality. A few cousins reached out privately to say they understood, that they'd experienced similar things, but they couldn't support me publicly because they didn't want to become targets themselves. Only one person, my younger sister, actually read what I'd written and tried to understand it. She called me crying, apologizing for not seeing how bad things had been for me, admitting that she'd witnessed the judgment and criticism I'd endured, but had stayed silent because she was afraid of becoming the next target. Her validation meant everything to me in that moment. This acknowledgement from someone who'd been there, who'd seen it all, who couldn't deny the reality of what I'd experienced. Standing firm on those boundaries was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Every family event became a test of my resolve. The first holiday after I'd set boundaries was Thanksgiving, and I almost didn't go. I knew it would be uncomfortable, that there would be tension, that people would either ignore me or make passive-aggressive comments. But I also knew that if I didn't show up, they'd use my absence as evidence that I was the one breaking up the family, that I was choosing to isolate myself, rather than acknowledging that I was asking for basic respect. So I went, armed with my therapist's advice and a plan for how to handle various scenarios. The moment I walked in, I could feel the hostility. People who usually greeted me warmly barely acknowledged my presence. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. My grandmother looked through me as if I were invisible. It was clear that I'd been labeled the problem, the troublemaker, the one who was destroying family harmony by refusing to accept their judgment anymore. During dinner, my uncle made a comment clearly directed at me about young people these days being too sensitive and thinking the world revolves around them. I felt my face flush, my stomach drop, that old instinct to defend myself or shrink away. But instead, I took a deep breath and simply said, I'm not engaging with indirect comments. If someone has something to say to me, they can address me directly and respectfully, or we don't need to discuss it at all. The table went silent. My uncle looked shocked that I'd called out his passive aggression. My mother looked mortified, but I didn't apologize, didn't take it back, didn't try to smooth things over. I'd stated a boundary, and I was going to maintain it. The dinner continued awkwardly, with people carefully avoiding any topics that might relate to me or my life. It wasn't comfortable, but it also wasn't the nightmare of constant judgment and criticism I'd always endured before. I'd created a small space of safety for myself, and even though everyone resented me for it, I knew I'd done the right thing. Over the following months, the family dynamics shifted in ways I hadn't anticipated. Some relatives doubled down on their attempts to regain control, escalating their manipulative tactics. My mother oscillated between crying phone calls where she begged me to just be reasonable and angry voicemails where she listed all my flaws and failures. My father tried the silent treatment, going weeks without contacting me, apparently expecting me to break down and apologize just to restore communication. My aunt organized family gatherings and deliberately didn't invite me, then made sure I knew about them through social media posts, trying to make me feel excluded and punished for my boundaries. But something interesting happened. I didn't break. Each time they tried a new manipulation tactic, each time they attempted to guilt or shame or punish me back into compliance, I recognized it for what it was and held my ground. I stopped answering manipulative phone calls. I blocked relatives who sent abusive messages. I declined invitations to gatherings where I knew I'd be attacked or frozen out. I started building a life that didn't revolve around their approval, and slowly, painfully, I began to discover who I actually was beneath all those layers of conditioning and fear. I reconnected with old friends who drifted away during my years of trying to please my family. I pursued hobbies and interests my family had always dismissed as silly or impractical. I made career decisions based on what excited me rather than what would impress my relatives. I dated people I actually liked instead of people who might meet my family's standards. For the first time in my life, I was living authentically, making choices that aligned with my values and desires rather than someone else's expectations. And you know what? I was happy. Genuinely, deeply happy in a way I'd never experienced before. Yes, I grieved the relationships with family members who chose their need for control over having a real relationship with me. Yes, it hurt to be excluded and judged and labeled as the problem. Yes, there were lonely moments when I desperately wished I had a functional, supportive family to turn to. But none of that pain compared to the relief of finally being free from constant criticism and judgment, the joy of discovering my authentic self, the peace of living without that perpetual anxiety that had haunted me for so long. About a year after I'd first set those boundaries, something unexpected happened. My father showed up at my apartment one evening without his usual entourage of opinions and judgments. He didn't let himself in like my mother used to do. He actually knocked and waited for me to answer. When I opened the door, he looked older somehow, tired, and there was something different in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Uncertainty. He asked if we could talk, really talk, and despite my hesitation, I invited him in. We sat in my living room, and for the first time in my entire life, my father listened to me without interrupting, without dismissing, without immediately countering everything I said with his own perspective. I told him everything, the whole painful truth about what it had been like growing up under constant scrutiny, how the family's judgment had damaged my mental health, how I'd spent years believing there was something fundamentally wrong with me because I could never seem to meet their expectations. I explained that setting boundaries wasn't about punishing them or pushing them away. It was about creating the possibility of authentic relationships based on mutual respect rather than control. I told him I wanted him in my life, but not as a judge or critic or someone who felt entitled to manage my decisions. I wanted a father who could love me for who I actually was, not for who he wished I would be. He was quiet for a long time after I finished speaking, and I braced myself for the defensive response I'd learned to expect from my family. But instead, he surprised me. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice cracked slightly. "I didn't realize. Or maybe I did, and I just didn't want to see it. I thought we were being good parents, good family members, by staying involved, by offering guidance, by trying to help you avoid mistakes. But you're right. We weren't respecting you as an adult capable of making your own decisions. We were treating you like a project to be managed, and that was wrong." I felt tears streaming down my face before I even realized I was crying. This acknowledgement, this validation from someone who'd been part of the problem for so long, meant more to me than I can adequately express. It didn't erase years of pain, didn't magically fix everything that was broken, but it opened a door I'd thought was permanently sealed. It showed me that change was possible, that some relationships could evolve even after tremendous damage, that boundaries could actually create space for healthier connection rather than just destroying everything. My father and I started rebuilding our relationship slowly, carefully, with clear boundaries in place that he actually respected. He stopped offering unsolicited advice. He asked about my life without judgment. He apologized when he slipped back into old patterns, and he genuinely tried to do better. It wasn't perfect. We still had difficult moments, but it was real in a way our relationship had never been before. For the first time, I felt like he was trying to know me as an actual person, rather than as an extension of himself and his expectations. Unfortunately, not everyone in my family followed his example. My mother remained convinced that I was being unreasonable and that the whole situation was my fault. She continued her pattern of emotional manipulation, alternating between tearful guilt trips and angry accusations, never once genuinely considering that her behavior might have been harmful. My grandmother died without ever speaking to me again after that Thanksgiving dinner, and I carry complicated grief about that, a mixture of sadness for the relationship we could have had, and relief that I'm no longer subject to her particular brand of controlling judgment. Several aunts and uncles maintained their stance that I was the problem, that I'd been corrupted by modern ideas about boundaries and self-care, that I should just accept family input as the price of being part of a family. I had to accept that some relationships simply couldn't be salvaged, not because I hadn't tried hard enough, but because those people were more invested in maintaining their power than in having genuine relationships with me. That acceptance was painful, but also liberating. I stopped waiting for certain relatives to change, stopped hoping that if I just explained myself better or set the perfect boundary, they'd finally understand. I released myself from the obligation to have relationships with people who fundamentally didn't respect me, even if those people were family. I learned that blood relation doesn't obligate you to accept mistreatment, that you can love people from a distance, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and others is to step away from dynamics that bring out the worst in everyone. The ripple effects of my boundary setting extended beyond my immediate situation. My younger sister started setting her own boundaries, inspired by watching me survive the family's backlash. She dealt with her own version of the anger and manipulation, but she also found her own freedom on the other side of it. A few younger cousins reached out privately to ask for advice about dealing with family pressure, confessing that they'd watched what I'd gone through and were trying to figure out how to claim their own autonomy without being completely destroyed in the process. I realized that sometimes taking a stand, even when it costs you dearly, can create permission for others to do the same. Maybe that's part of why families fight so hard against boundary setters, because one person's liberation threatens the entire system of control that's kept everyone in line for generations. Through therapy, supportive friendships, and a lot of hard inner work, I developed a much clearer sense of who I am independent of my family's opinions. I learned to identify my own values, my own preferences, my own goals without the constant noise of other people's expectations drowning out my inner voice. I discovered that I actually enjoy things my family always mocked, that I have talents they never acknowledged, that I'm capable of making good decisions without their input. I built a chosen family of friends who celebrate me rather than trying to change me, who support my growth rather than trying to keep me small, who love me unconditionally rather than with the thousand strings attached that characterized my biological family's version of love. I won't pretend that everything is perfect now or that setting boundaries solved all my problems. I still struggle sometimes with that old programming, that voice in my head that sounds like my grandmother or my aunt telling me I'm doing everything wrong. I still feel guilt sometimes when I maintain boundaries that cause other people discomfort, even when I know those boundaries are healthy and necessary. I still have moments of grief for the family I wish I'd had, for the unconditional support I deserved but never received, for the relationships that couldn't survive my insistence on being treated with respect. But here's what I know with absolute certainty. Setting boundaries was the best decision I ever made for my mental health and well-being. The peace I feel now, the freedom to be myself without constant fear of judgment, the ability to make choices based on my own values rather than someone else's expectations, these things are worth every uncomfortable confrontation, every lost relationship, every moment of standing alone against family pressure. I am happier, healthier, more authentically myself than I've ever been, and I would go through it all again to get to this place of genuine self-acceptance and freedom. If you're in a similar situation, if you're reading this and recognizing your own family dynamics in my story, I want you to know something important. You're not crazy, you're not ungrateful, you're not selfish for wanting to be treated with respect and dignity. You have the right to set boundaries, even with family, especially with family. You have the right to decide what kind of relationships you want in your life and what treatment you're willing to accept. You have the right to protect your mental health and well-being, even if other people don't understand or approve of your choices. Setting boundaries doesn't mean you don't love your family. It means you love yourself enough to insist on being treated well. And that's not selfish. That's essential. Yes, there will be pushback. Yes, people will try to manipulate you back into compliance. Yes, you might lose relationships that you thought were permanent. But you'll also gain something infinitely more valuable. Yourself, your autonomy, your peace of mind, your authentic life. And that, I promise you, is worth fighting for. The journey isn't easy. There were so many times I wanted to give up, to apologize, to go back to being the people pleaser who sacrificed herself to keep everyone else comfortable. There were nights I cried myself to sleep, questioning everything, wondering if I was making a terrible mistake. There were family events I attended where I felt completely alone even though I was surrounded by relatives. There were holidays that felt more sad than celebratory because I was grieving relationships that had died or transformed beyond recognition. But through all of it, I held on to this truth. I deserve to be loved for who I am, not for how well I conform to someone else's expectations. I deserve relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided submission. I deserve to make my own choices and live with their consequences without a chorus of critics weighing in on every decision. I deserve to take up space in my own life rather than constantly shrinking myself to accommodate other people's comfort. And so do you. So do you. The freedom on the other side of boundary setting is real, and it's worth every hard conversation, every disappointed relative, every accusation of selfishness or ingratitude. The peace of living authentically, of knowing you're being true to yourself even when it's difficult, of building relationships based on genuine connection rather than obligation or control, that peace is precious beyond measure. I'm not going to tell you it's simple or that everyone will eventually understand and come around, because that's not always how it works. Some relationships will end. Some family members will never accept your boundaries. Some people will remain convinced that you're the problem rather than examining their own behavior. And that's painful, but it's also not your responsibility to fix. You can't control other people's reactions to your boundaries. You can only control whether you maintain those boundaries for your own well-being. Looking back now, I see that younger version of myself sitting at that dinner table, surrounded by relatives who felt entitled to judge every aspect of my life, and I feel such compassion for her. She was so anxious, so desperate to please, so convinced that she had to earn love through perfect compliance with everyone else's expectations. She didn't know yet that she was enough exactly as she was, that she didn't need to twist herself into shapes to be worthy of love, that the right people would love her without requiring her to diminish herself. I wish I could go back and tell her that the hard road ahead would lead to liberation, that the pain of setting boundaries would ultimately be so much less than the pain of living without them, that she was about to discover a version of herself she didn't even know existed beneath all those layers of fear and people-pleasing. But maybe she needed to walk that road herself, to fight those battles, to claim her own freedom through her own courage. Maybe that's the only way any of us truly learn that we have the right to advocate for ourselves, to set limits, to insist on being treated well even by people who've never treated us well before. As I share this story with you today, I'm 31 years old, and I've been maintaining boundaries with my family for 5 years now. Some relationships have healed and evolved into something healthier. Others have ended completely. Most exist somewhere in between, with varying levels of closeness and varying degrees of acceptance of my autonomy. My relationship with my father has become genuinely meaningful in ways I never thought possible. My sister and I are closer than we've ever been, bonded by our shared experience of breaking free from family dysfunction. I have a small circle of relatives who respect my boundaries and with whom I've built authentic, reciprocal relationships. And I've made peace with the relationships that couldn't survive my insistence on being treated with respect, understanding that their loss, while sad, was ultimately necessary for my well-being. I've built a beautiful life on the other side of those boundaries, a life filled with people who genuinely know me and love me for who I am, work that fulfills me and aligns with my values, hobbies, and interests that bring me joy without anyone telling me they're silly or impractical. And most importantly, a relationship with myself characterized by self-respect and self-compassion, rather than constant self-criticism and anxiety. I wake up most mornings feeling peaceful rather than anxious, excited about the day ahead rather than dreading the next judgment or criticism. I make decisions confidently, trusting my own judgment rather than constantly second-guessing myself or seeking approval from people who've proven they don't have my best interests at heart. I've learned to recognize manipulative behavior quickly and shut it down before it can take root. I've developed the ability to walk away from situations and relationships that compromise my well-being, even when walking away is difficult or lonely. So here's what I want to leave you with today. The hard-won wisdom from someone who's been through the fire of family conflict and come out the other side. Your well-being matters. Your mental health matters. Your right to live authentically matters. Your need for respect and dignity matters. And none of these things should be conditional on pleasing everyone around you or meeting standards that have nothing to do with your actual happiness or growth. Setting boundaries with family is hard, possibly the hardest thing you'll ever do, but it's also one of the most important acts of self-love and self-preservation you can engage in. You deserve relationships that feel good, that support your growth, that celebrate who you are rather than constantly trying to change you. And if your family can't or won't provide those kinds of relationships, you have the right to limit contact, to end relationships, to choose distance over dysfunction. That doesn't make you a bad person. That makes you someone who values yourself enough to insist on being treated well. Now I want to hear from you. Have you struggled with setting boundaries in your own family? Have you experienced that suffocating feeling of being judged and controlled by relatives who claim to only want what's best for you? Drop a comment below and share your story, because I truly believe that sharing our experiences helps all of us feel less alone in our struggles. And if you found value in this story, If something I shared resonated with you or helped you see your own situation more clearly, please do me a favor. Hit that like button to let me know this content is meaningful to you. Your likes help me understand what stories matter most to you and encourage me to keep sharing these difficult but important experiences. And if you're not already subscribed to Living Through It, click that subscribe button right now, because this channel is all about real stories from real people navigating the messy, complicated, beautiful challenge of being human. We talk about family dynamics, mental health, personal growth, setting boundaries, healing from trauma, and building lives we're proud of even when it means going against what everyone expects from us. Hit that notification bell too so you never miss a story, because I'm committed to creating a space where we can all be honest about our struggles and celebrate our victories, where we can learn from each other's experiences and support each other through the hard stuff. Remember, you're not alone in whatever you're going through. There are thousands of people watching this right now who understand exactly what it feels like to fight for your right to be yourself, who've faced the same judgments and manipulations, who've had to make the same painful choices between compliance and authenticity. We're all in this together, figuring it out as we go, learning to love ourselves enough to insist on being treated with respect. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Thank you for giving me the space to be vulnerable and honest about one of the hardest periods of my life. Thank you for being part of this community where we can share our truths without fear of judgment. Until next time, remember, you are worthy of respect. You are worthy of love. You are worthy of living life on your own terms. Take care of yourself. Set those boundaries, and never apologize for refusing to shrink yourself to fit someone else's expectations. I'll see you in the next video.